I died of cold in a guest wing they'd moved me to for my health, in a house with 11 working hearths, none of them lit in my corridor for 3 days, and when I opened my eyes again, the parchment that would have made my own murderer, my legal son, was still lying unsigned on the table in front of me. I want you to understand that plainly from the very start, because I spent an embarrassingly long time in my first life pretending it had been an accident of neglect rather than a plan. It was not neglect. Neglect doesn't require 3 separate servants to independently decide, on the same 3 nights, that the Margravine's fire could wait until morning. The last thing I remember of that first life was the particular quality of silence in an unheated room at the end of winter, and the sound of a boy's boots on the stair, unhurried, already comfortable in a house he had decided was his. So when I woke instead at the long table beneath Almark's painted ceiling, 26 years old, my lungs full and easy, the same banners hanging from the rafters, black and silver, the colours of House von Alborn, I did not spend even a full minute being grateful for the second chance before I understood exactly what I intended to do with it. I should tell you, before anything else, what that word Baron had actually cost me the first time, because I think it matters more than any single scheme that came after it. I had carried 2 children in my first years at Almark, and lost them both, the second so late and so hard that the March's own physician had told me, gently enough, that a third attempt might well cost me my life along with the child's. I had grieved both losses privately, properly, the way any mother grieves, and I had watched that private grief slowly become public property instead, whispered over at every gathering, weighed and measured by women who had never once carried a child themselves, as though my body's plain misfortune were a character flaw I ought to have corrected through better behaviour. I had believed them for longer than I liked to admit. I had believed that Jorin's arrival was a mercy I hadn't earned, and should therefore accept without complaint whatever cruelty came bundled inside it, because a barren woman I had been taught to understand did not get to be particular about the shape of the family she was finally, belatedly, permitted to have. I did not believe that any longer waking at that table a second time. Losing 2 children had been a grief, it had never once been a debt, and I was tired, in ways I hadn't even fully understood until I felt the fury of a second chance settle into my chest, of paying interest on a debt I had never actually owed. The parchment lay before me on the table, precisely where I remembered it. My husband, Conrad, stood at the head of that table in his travelling coat, dust from the border road still on his boots, looking at me with the particular hopeful gentleness he always wore when he wanted something from me, and had convinced himself the wanting was for my own good. Beside him stood a boy of perhaps 11, dark-haired, grey-eyed, dressed in mourning clothes, cut a little too fine for an orphan's charity case. Jorin, small enough to look pitiful. Already, if you knew what to look for, entirely too comfortable performing it. Utterly. Conrad's voice was warm, careful, the voice he used when he'd already decided the conversation's ending and merely needed me to arrive there peacefully. This is Jorin, Captain Cray's boy. You remember Cray, who held the Eastern Pass for us at such cost. His son has no one left. If you'll sign, the March will finally have an heir, and the boy will have a mother's name to carry him. In my first life, I had looked at that sentence and heard only the kindness in it. The chance to be needed by someone again after 2 lost pregnancies had quietly convinced half the March I was barren and unfit, and, worse, that I had somehow failed at the one duty a Margravine was permitted to have opinions about. I had signed that parchment with tears of gratitude in my eyes. This time I looked past Conrad entirely to his mother. Adelind von Alborn, the Dowager Margravine, stood at the table's far end in unrelieved black, her hands folded, her face arranged into an expression of dignified sorrow for a fallen captain she had, as far as I knew in that first life, never once met. She was watching me now with the stillness of a woman who has already rehearsed every possible version of this scene and is only waiting to see which one plays out. I had died believing that stillness was grief, now it was patience. Lord Cedric explained the particulars to me once already, I said, though no one had yet mentioned Lord Cedric, and I watched the flicker of surprise cross 3 faces at once before I continued smoothly. Once I sign, Joran becomes my legal son. My name enters the registry as his mother. My dowry lands stand to support his education, and my seal will be required for his future inheritance of the march. Have I understood the arrangement correctly? Conrad blinked. You've studied the matter already. I'm glad. I'd hoped you would come to see it favorably. I've studied it more thoroughly than you realize, husband, I said, and reached across the table, took the parchment in both hands, and tore it cleanly down the center. The hall went the particular kind of silent that precedes a scandal rather than follows one. Adeline's composure did not crack, but her folded hands tightened, just slightly, at the knuckle. If the boy has a mother already living, I said, laying the torn halves beside my untouched wine, however far she may be, then he belongs with her, not signed into a stranger's name for the convenience of people who have never once asked him what he wants. Joran's grey eyes came up to meet mine then, and for one unguarded instant, before he remembered to look wounded, I saw exactly what I had missed in my first life. Not a frightened orphan wondering whether he'd be loved, but a boy already sat-tallying which performance would win him the most, watching the room the way a card player watches the table rather than his own hand. I do not need a false mother, Joran said, lifting his chin, in precisely the tone I remembered from my own deathbed, though this time it came a decade earlier than I'd ever heard it before. Everyone at the academy already says the Margravine is barren. Why should I pretend otherwise? A lady near the table's edge gasped. No one defended me. That I remembered clearly from both leaves now, not the cruelty itself, but the waiting, the whole hall holding its breath, to see whether I would swallow the insult the way a proper Margravine was supposed to swallow every insult that kept the peace. I did not swallow it. You've answered my question rather more honestly than I expected. For a boy who's meant to be grieving his father 3 weeks in the ground, I said, and turned to Conrad before the boy could recover his composure. Husband, I would like to know a great deal more about Captain Cray's family before anyone signs anything binding my name to his son's future. Starting with where his actual mother might be found. Adeline's voice, when it came, was very smooth. The captain's wife died some years past. Utterly, there is no mother to consult then, I imagine, I said, holding her gaze. His aunts, his cousins, his regiment's own records will tell me a great deal more than a boy of 11, who's already decided I'm not worth being honest with. I find I have rather a lot of patience for reading records, my lady. I've recently discovered I have far less than I once did for being told what to feel grateful for. I want to tell you honestly that walking away from that table felt like walking on legs I'd never properly used before. In my first life, I had spent every year after that day trying to earn Joran's love through patience, gifts, and a slowly shrinking sense of my own worth, telling myself that a mother's job was to keep giving until the giving finally worked. It had never worked. It was never going to work, because love was never actually the transaction Joran or his grandmother were interested in making with me. Conrad found me in my own solar that evening, troubled in the particular way he always was when the world refused to arrange itself as gently as he'd hoped. You embarrassed my mother in front of the whole hall, he said, though not unkindly, more baffled than angry. The boy has no one, Ottilie, whatever his manners. Surely that alone deserves some compassion. I agree entirely, I said, which is precisely why I intend to find out who he actually belongs to, rather than simply accepting whichever version of his story your mother finds most convenient for this house. Something in Conrad's face shifted, uncertain. He was not, I had come to understand even in my first life, a cruel man. He was a tired one, worn thin by a boarder that never stopped needing him, and a mother who had managed every domestic matter in this house since before he could properly walk, and it had simply never once occurred to him that her management might not always serve his own family's good. You think my mother is lying to me, he said slowly. I think, I said, that I intend to find out one way or another, and I would rather you heard it from me directly than from whatever version reaches you last. He did not argue further that night, though I could see in the careful way he studied me afterward that some old, comfortable certainty about his own household had been quietly disturbed, perhaps for the first time in his adult life. Adeline tested that disturbance within the week, in the particular way she tested everything, socially, publicly, where a wrong answer would cost me rather more than a private conversation ever could. She held a dinner for 3 visiting border families, ostensibly to welcome the season's first snows properly, though I understood well enough it was staged for my benefit as much as anyone's. Joran sat at her right hand, dressed in mourning still, playing the grieving, gently wronged orphan for an audience that hadn't yet heard the scene at the long table. "The Margravine has had such trouble with children of her own," Adeline said to the table at large, her voice pitched, with exactly the right note of sorrowful sympathy, which I think explains why she found young Joran's manner so difficult to warm to. "Grief makes us all a little raw, doesn't it?" Several guests murmured something sympathetic in my general direction, the particular sympathy people offer a woman they've already decided to pity rather than respect. In my first life, I remembered, that sentence alone had been enough to keep me quiet for the rest of the evening. So thoroughly had I absorbed the idea that my own losses were a fair subject for other people's dinner conversation. "Grief does make us raw, my lady," I agreed pleasantly. "I find it also makes some of us considerably less patient with being managed. I've discovered this past month that I have rather less patience for that than I once did, whatever the cause." "Managed," Adeline repeated, her smile not moving at all. "What an unusual word to use of a mother's care. It's the word that fits," I said. "I've read Captain Owe's regimental records this week, my lady. I find record-keeping a most restful occupation. You'd be surprised how much a well-kept ledger can clarify. For a woman people assume has nothing better to do than nurse her own grief quietly in a corner." I watched something flicker just once, behind Adeline's composed face, there and gone before any of our guests could have named it. Joran's fork paused over his plate for exactly 1 beat too long. "How industrious," Adeline said, finally recovering smoothly. "I do hope you haven't tired yourself with such dull work on top of everything else." "Not remotely," I said. "I find I have rather a great deal of stamina for it, once I've decided something is worth finishing properly." The rest of the dinner passed in ordinary conversation, but I caught, more than once, Adeline's gaze resting on me with a new and careful attention, the attention of a woman recalculating exactly how dangerous an obstacle I might prove to be. I did not mind being recalculated. I minded in my first life disappearing so thoroughly that no one had ever bothered to calculate me at all. I began the very next morning exactly where my father's clerks would have begun with any suspicious claim, at the source. I sent for Hansa, my old nurse, the one person in that entire keep whose loyalty had never once been for sale. "You remember Captain Cray," I said, once we were alone in my chambers, the door properly shut. "A fine officer," Hansa said, "died holding the Eastern Pass 2 winters back, when the mountain snows came early and caught half the garrison unprepared. A hard death and an honest one. Why do you ask, my lady?" "Because I'm told his son has no family left but this house," I said, "and I find myself wondering why a captain's family, however humble, would be so entirely without aunts, cousins, or a regiment that remembers him." Hansa's weathered face went thoughtful. "I recall his sister came through the market town 2 summers past, asking after a pension, a widow herself, I believe, raising her own boy on very little. I couldn't say if she's still there. I felt something settle into place, cold and certain, the particular satisfaction of watching a lie's edges finally show themselves." "Then I think," I said, "it's time I rode to the market town myself, before anyone here has cause to wonder why." The market town of Arles Cross sat 2 hours' ride from the keep, along a road I remembered, in my first life having travelled perhaps twice in 20 years, always for some formal errand that kept me safely inside a closed carriage. This time I rode it myself, plainly dressed, with only Hansa and a single manservant for company, and asked after Captain Cray's family at the first honest tavern we found. It did not take long. Grief, unlike scheming, tends to leave a plain and traceable path. Berthold Cray's sister, a widow named Greta, kept a small dairy stall at the edge of the market square, and beside her, minding a pen of goats with the focused seriousness only a child gives to a task he's been trusted with, stood a boy of perhaps 8, dark-haired, quiet-eyed, dressed in clothes clearly mended more than once. "Matthis," Greta called to him when I introduced myself only as a traveller asking after her late brother. careful not to reveal my title before I understood the whole shape of what I'd found. "Come make your bow to the lady." The boy came, bowed with a solemn, careful correctness that told me exactly how few opportunities he'd had to practice it, and looked up at me with his father's own grey eyes. I would learn later, though I did not yet know to look for the resemblance. "Your father was Captain Cray," I said gently, "the one who held the Eastern Pass." Something in the boy's small face went very still, proud and grieving all at once. "Yes, my lady, my aunt says he died so the mountain folk could keep their homes." "He did," I said, and found my voice was not quite steady. I never had the chance to thank him properly for it. "I should like to remedy that, if your aunt will permit me a proper conversation." Greta's eyes had narrowed slightly at my manner of speech, the particular caution of a woman who has learned that lords rarely visit dairy stalls without wanting something in return. "You're no ordinary traveller," she said. "Who are you truly, my lady?" I told her. I watched her face go through disbelief, then a careful, frightened wariness, and I understood, before she'd said another word, that she already knew far more than she'd intended to reveal. "There's a boy at your keep," she said finally, low enough that Mathis, sent to fetch water at my quiet request, would not overhear. "Calling himself my brother's son, I know of him. I wrote to the Dowager Margravine myself. 2 winters back, when word reached me, my nephew's name was being used to secure some grand inheritance in the March. I received no answer. I thought it wisest, after that silence, to say nothing further and keep my own boy safely out of whatever game was being played with his father's memory." "You did exactly right to protect him," I said. "I intend to see that the truth is put right, and that your brother's memory is no longer spent as currency for someone else's ambition. I would like your permission, in time, to bring Mathis to Almark properly, not to claim him as a political instrument, but because I think a boy who bows that carefully for a stranger deserves rather more than a goat pen and mended clothes for the whole of his childhood, if his aunt will allow it." Greta studied me for a long moment, weighing, I imagine, every reason a poor widow learns to distrust a noblewoman's sudden interest in her family. "He's all I have left of my brother," she said. "I'll not hand him over for anyone's comfort but his own." "Then let me earn your trust properly, before I ask for anything at all," I said. "I find I have rather a lot of practice these days in proving myself with actions rather than promises." I rode back to Almark that evening with considerably more than I'd arrived with, and spent the following weeks building the rest of the case as carefully as I'd once, in a life I remembered only in fragments of cold and betrayal, built nothing at all, having been too grateful for the appearance of a family to ever question its foundations. That care verily failed me twice before the month was out. The first time, I returned from my own solar to find Ruprecht Voss waiting outside my chamber door, ostensibly to discuss the autumn rents. Though his eyes moved, just once, to the small locked case where I kept my private accounting of everything Hansa and Greta Cray had told me. "The Dowager Margravine mentioned you'd taken an interest in the old regimental pension rolls," he said, his voice carefully mild. "I keep those records myself, my lady. I'd be glad to save you the trouble of digging through them unassisted." "How thoughtful," I said, matching his mildness exactly. "I find I prefer to do my own digging, Master Voss. I've always learned a house's true business better with my own hands in its ledgers than with someone else's summary of what I ought to find there." He did not press further, but I noticed, that same evening, that the lock on my case had been tried, clumsily by someone unpracticed at it, the small telltale scratch along the brass that Hansa's own sharp eyes caught before I did. "Someone's been at your things, my lady," she said grimly. "Then it's fortunate," I said, "that I keep the parts that matter rather better hidden than a case any determined hand could pry open." I moved my true records that same night, sewn into the lining of an old riding cloak no one in that house had any particular reason to search, and left the case itself stocked with nothing more damning than half-finished embroidery patterns. A decoy convincing enough that when it was searched again, a fortnight later, whoever did the searching found only proof of a Margravine's idle hours, and nothing at all worth reporting back to Adelind. The second near miss came from Joran himself, and frightened me rather more, because I had not expected a boy of 11 to be quite so perceptive. I found him in the keep's east corridor one afternoon, ostensibly at his lessons, though the book in his lap lay closed. He watched me pass with the particular stillness I remembered too well from my first life, the stillness of someone deciding how much a moment was worth before spending anything on it. "You went to Ull's Cross," he said without preamble. "I heard the stable boys talking. You didn't take the usual escort." "I did," I said carefully. "I find the market town restful this time of year." "You're lying," Joran said, with a child's blunt certainty, though something uncertain flickered beneath it too, as if he weren't entirely sure what he wanted my answer to be. "Grandmother says you're trying to find something to use against me." I crouched then, so that we were nearly of a height, and studied him properly, the way I wished someone had studied me at 11, before I'd learned that every kindness offered to me came itemized with an expected return. "I'm trying to find the truth, Joran," I said. "I can't yet tell you what it is because I don't have all of it myself. But I promise you this much: whatever I find, I don't intend to use it to hurt a child who never asked to be put in the middle of grown people's schemes. I wish someone had made you that same promise a long time before I arrived." He looked at me for a long moment, grey eyes unreadable in the way only a child raised to perform emotion rather than feel it safely can manage. And then he stood, gathered his closed book, and walked away without another word. I did not know, watching him go, whether I had just reassured him or warned him straight back to his grandmother's door. I would not learn which for several more months, though I suspect, looking back, it was some uncertain measure of both. Captain Wilhelm Au, the regiment's quartermaster, kept meticulous records of every soldier under his command. Births, marriages, and next of kin all properly registered for the sake of pensions owed. I wrote to him under the plain cover of a margravine, reviewing the March's obligations to its fallen officers' families, a request no one at Almark thought suspicious enough to question. "Captain Cray's registered next of kin," Ewa wrote back in a hand as precise as his records, "lists one sister, Greta Cray, and one son, Matthis Cray, born of his marriage to the late Elspeth Cray. I show no other children, natural or otherwise, in any record bearing his name." I read that letter perhaps a dozen times before I let myself fully believe what it confirmed. Joran was not Captain Cray's son at all. He had never been. Graf Manfred Elsing visited Almark himself that same month, ostensibly to discuss a boundary dispute over grazing rights that had simmered between our two houses for a generation, though I understood well enough, by then, that the grazing dispute was merely the excuse he'd chosen to look me over properly before his own scheme came any closer to fruition. He was an affable man, silver at the temples, with the easy, practiced charm of someone who had spent 30 years learning exactly how much warmth a negotiation required before it curdled into suspicion. He complimented Almark's hospitality, admired the painted ceiling in the great hall, and asked, with a casualness I recognized immediately as entirely rehearsed, how young Joran was settling into his new position. "Remarkably well for a boy who's lost so much," I said. "Though I confess I've been rather occupied lately with a separate question, Graf Elsing. The particulars of exactly whose son he is." Something behind his affable eyes went very still, the same stillness I'd learned to recognize in Adelind, in Joran, in every person in that keep who'd built their comfort on a story they needed the rest of us to keep believing. "An unusual thing to question," he said carefully, "given the boy's own grandmother has vouched for him personally." "Grandmothers vouch for a great many things," I said. "I find I prefer a regiment's own pension rolls to any single person's word, however dignified the person. I understand you have some interest in the Almark passes yourself, Graf Elsing. I do hope that interest hasn't been resting on the same foundation as young Joran's claim." He recovered his smile quickly, though not quite quickly enough. "I'm sure I don't know what foundation you mean, Margravine. I merely wish this march well as any good neighbour would." "Then I imagine you'll have no objection," I said pleasantly, "to my bringing the whole matter of the succession before the March Council properly, with every neighbour's interest laid out plainly for the Commissioner's review. Good neighbours, I find, rarely mind a little sunlight on their good intentions." He left 2 days later, considerably earlier than his stated business required, and I understood, watching his party ride out through Almark's gates, that I had just forced his hand rather sooner than either of us had planned. It meant the reckoning, when it came, would come faster than I'd hoped to prepare for it. It also meant Elsing no longer had the luxury of pretending, even to himself, that his part in the scheme might go forever unnoticed. It took a further month of careful, patient work, quiet conversations with old servants who remembered rather more than they'd ever been asked to share, and one particularly useful evening spent going through Ruprecht Voss's own household correspondence while the Castellan was away collecting autumn rents, before the rest of the truth assembled itself into a shape I could finally bring before a magistrate. Jorin was Adeline's own grandson, born to her elder son Sigmund, Conrad's brother, and a woman of no family standing Adeline had considered entirely beneath the house. Sigmund had died young before the boy's birth, and rather than acknowledge a grandson whose mother she despised, Adeline had quietly arranged for the child to be raised at a distance, out of sight, until Conrad's own marriage produced no living heir and a far more useful opportunity presented itself. A dead border captain's name borrowed from a family too poor and too distant to easily contradict the claim, draped over her own hidden grandson like a coat that fit rather better than his true story ever could. Ruprecht Voss had forged the parentage records for a price. Graf Manfred Elsing, a neighbouring count with his own designs on Almark's mountain pass and its silver veins, had supplied that price in exchange for a quiet promise. Once Jorin inherited the march under Adeline's continued guidance, certain mining rights and past tolls currently belonging to Almark would find their way, by careful degrees, into Elsing's own coffers instead. I want to be honest about what I felt, reading that whole scheme laid bare in my own private accounting at last. It was not triumph, not yet. It was something closer to grief for the boy Jorin actually was. Underneath all of it, not a monster born, but a child raised from infancy to understand that love was a performance you gave in exchange for a title, because that was the only love his own grandmother had ever offered him either. That understanding did not make me any less determined to see the scheme stopped. It only meant I intended to stop it without pretending this time that pity for a child excused what the adults around him had built on his back. I brought the whole matter before Conrad myself in our own solar, laying out Auer's letter, Greta's testimony and the household correspondence side by side, the way my own governess had once taught me to lay out an argument no reasonable person could survive intact. Conrad read through it in silence, his face going through disbelief, then something rawer, older, the particular grief of a man realizing the mother who raised him had spent his entire life managing him rather than loving him honestly. She told me the boy was Cray's son, he said finally, very quietly. She told me it would finally settle the question of the succession, without troubling either of us with further grief over the children we'd lost. I believed her because it was easier than doubting her. I understand that particular ease better than I'd like to admit, I said. I spent an entire life believing easier stories too, husband. I don't intend to spend a second one that way. What do you mean to do? He asked. I mean to bring the whole of it before the March Council, I said properly, publicly, with Captain Owe's records and Greta Cray's testimony both present, so that no one in this march can later claim the truth was managed quietly away in a private room, the way everything in this house has always been managed quietly away before. Conrad was silent for a long moment, then to his credit he nodded. Then I'll stand beside you when you do it. I find I owe my brother's memory that much at least, and I owe you rather more than I've yet found the words for. The March Council convened that winter in Almark's Great Hall before the assembled border lords, a royal commissioner sent from the capital to ratify any change in succession, and at my particular insistence, both Greta Cray and Captain Wilhelm Au brought forward under my own protection to testify to what their records and their grief could confirm. Adeline stood very straight through the whole proceeding, exactly as I imagine she had rehearsed standing through every difficult negotiation of her long life, and when the commissioner called for any objection to Jorin's formal recognition as heir presumptive, I rose from my seat beside Conrad and gave mine. I object, I said, into a hall gone properly silent. on the grounds that the boy presented to this council as Captain Berthold Kray's son bears no relation to that officer whatsoever, and that the parentage records supporting his claim were forged by this March's own castellan, at the Dowager Margravine's direction, in exchange for silver from Graf Elsing's coffers. The uproar that followed was, I confess, rather satisfying to witness after a first life spent being too grateful to ever raise my voice in that hall at all. Captain Owe's regimental records, read aloud into the council's own minutes, confirmed Mathis Kray as the captain's only living child. Greta Kray's testimony, delivered with a plain, unpolished honesty that no noble performance in that hall could match, confirmed she'd written to Adeline herself 2 winters past and received only silence in return. Ruprecht Voss, confronted with his own forged ledgers, and the promise of the Crown's leniency in exchange for full confession, broke within the hour, naming both Adelind and Graf Elsing as the scheme's true architects. Graf Elsing, seated among the visiting border lords, attempted for a time to distance himself entirely, protesting that any correspondence bearing his seal must have been forged as thoroughly as Joran's parentage. It was Hansa, of all people, who undid that particular defence, producing a household account of the Graf's own steward's visits to Almark across the preceding 2 years, dates and purposes recorded in her own plain hand from her decades of quietly keeping track of every comer and goer through the keep's kitchen entrance, the kind of record no lord ever thinks to guard, because no lord ever thinks a kitchen matters enough to watch. An old woman's habit, Hansa said, when the commissioner asked how she'd come to keep such notes at all. I've tended this house's hearths and its comings and goings for 30 years, my Lord Commissioner. I find it pays in a house like this one to remember who visits and when, and to say nothing of it until someone finally asks the right question. The hall's laughter at that, brief and startled, did more to unmake Graf Elsing's composure than any ledger had managed alone. Adeline did not confess, not directly, but her silence once every document had been read and every witness heard, spoke rather more plainly than any admission could have. The Royal Commissioner's judgment stripped Joran of any claim to the succession, stripped Graf Elsing of the mining concessions he'd been secretly promised, and placed Adelind under formal censure, her authority within the March's household dissolved entirely and placed, by the Commissioner's own order, into my hands as Margravine, alongside Conrad's. You were supposed to be grateful for whatever family this house offered you, Adelind said to me afterward, in the emptying hall, her voice low and bitter. A barren woman should have been glad of any child at all. I was that grateful once, I said. In a life you'll never remember, my lady, I was so grateful I let this house work me into an early grave and called it devotion the whole way there. I've since decided gratitude isn't owed to people who only offer you a family in order to better rob you of everything else. I find I prefer choosing my own instead. Joran, in the aftermath, was not cast out to fend for himself, whatever satisfaction the hall's uproar might have suggested I wanted. I spoke with him myself, once the council had dispersed, a boy of 11 suddenly stripped of the only story he'd ever been given about who he was allowed to become. I have no family now, he said, and for the first time since I'd met him in either life, there was no performance left in his voice at all, only a child's plain fear. You have a grandmother who used you badly, I said, and that is a genuine grief, whatever else she's done. But you are not without every door in this march, Joran. I intend to see you properly fostered, with people who will value you for something other than what your name might one day be worth. Whether you let that kindness in or spend your whole life waiting for the next person to try using you the way your grandmother did, I find is rather more up to you than to me. I do not know even now precisely what became of the boy he grew into. I placed him in the end with a modest but honest family of the March's own minor gentry, people with no particular ambition to gain from his presence, and I wrote to check on him twice a year for a decade afterward, though I never again tried to make him mine. Some kinds of love cannot be built on a foundation someone else has already poisoned, no matter how much you might wish otherwise. Mathis Kray came to Almark the following spring, at his Aunt Greta's own eventual, carefully considered blessing, once she'd watched me keep every quiet promise I'd made her over the better part of a year. He arrived clutching a small wooden goat he'd carved himself, entirely unimpressed by the size of the keep, and asked me, within his first hour under my roof, whether it was true that Margravines were allowed to muck out their own stables if they simply wanted to. "I've never actually tried," I told him. "Perhaps you'll teach me," he did, that very afternoon, and I laughed harder mucking out a stall in my second life than I remembered laughing at any single moment in the whole of my first one. Mathis was not, in those early months, an easy child to reach, whatever his careful bow at our first meeting might have suggested. He had spent his whole short life learning that comfort could be taken away as quickly as it was given, and he watched every kindness I offered him with a wariness that reminded me, more than I liked to admit, of Joran's own calculating stillness, though rooted in something far gentler, not a hunger to win, but a fear of being fooled. "You don't have to keep me," he told me once, perhaps a month into his stay, entirely without self-pity, the way a child states a fact he's already made his peace with. "My aunt says grandfolk change their minds. I won't be surprised if you send me back." "I won't," I said, "but I understand why you'd want to hear it more than once before you believe it. I'll tell you as many times as it takes, Mathis. I'm not in any particular hurry." It took, in the end, nearly a full year before he stopped flinching, faintly, whenever I raised my voice for any reason at all, even in simple delight, and rather longer than that before he called Almark home, without immediately correcting himself afterward. I did not rush any of it. I had spent my own first life being rushed into gratitude before I'd had the chance to properly feel safe first, and I was not about to teach a child the same backward lesson. Conrad, for his part, found in Mathis something I don't believe he'd expected to want at all. An audience entirely uninterested in his title, who cared a great deal more about whether the Margrave could actually ride a horse well than whether he commanded a border garrison competently. He taught the boy to fish that first summer, badly at first, both of them soaked to the knees and laughing at their own incompetence, in a way I'd never once witnessed from my husband in my entire first life, when every hour he wasn't at the border had been spent managing some fresh domestic crisis his mother had engineered. He asked me today why I never taught him anything before Mathis came. Conrad told me one evening, a rueful, unfamiliar softness in his voice. I didn't have a good answer for him. I don't think I have a good answer for you either, if you asked me the same question about the years before all this. I'm not asking, I said. I'm only glad you're answering it now, for both of us, rather than going on pretending the question never needed asking at all. It was Hansa who found the second child, that following spring, a girl of perhaps 6 discovered half-starved near the border road after a famine had swept through the mountain villages the previous autumn, too weak even to give her own name clearly. We called her Runa, after Hansa's own long-dead mother, and I sat with her through a fever that frightened me rather more than I let anyone see, remembering with a clarity I wished I didn't still carry, exactly what it felt like to be a woman no one thought worth keeping warm. "She'll live," the physician told me on the third night when the fever finally broke. "You've a gift for this, my lady, if you don't mind my saying so. Not every household takes such trouble over children with no name and no claim on anyone's charity." "I mind rather less than I once would have," I said, "being told I have a gift for caring for children no one else thought worth the trouble. I've decided to consider it the finest compliment available to me. I made a rule that first winter with Mathis under my roof that I have kept in every house I've had authority over since. No hearth in Almark would ever again go untended while I had breath to see it tended myself. I walked the corridors some nights, in those early months, simply checking each fire myself, unable to fully trust anyone else's word for it, until Hansa gently told me I was frightening the younger maids with my midnight inspections, and I finally let myself believe the rule had taken root without my having to enforce it personally every single night. Mathis asked me once that first winter why I cared so much about the fires. "Because I was cold once, in a house with plenty of wood and no one willing to spend the effort to keep me warm," I said. I decided that would never again be true for anyone under my roof if I had any say in the matter. He considered that with the particular gravity children give to answers they sense are larger than the question they asked. "I'll keep the fires too then," he said, "when I'm grown so no one's ever cold in a house that's mine. That," I told him, "is the finest inheritance I could think to leave anyone." Conrad and I built something in the years that followed that I had never once managed in my first life. A marriage based on plain honesty rather than his mother's careful management of every difficult truth between us. He was slower to challenge Adeline's old habits of control than I might have liked in those first months after the council, but he kept trying, and I had learned by then the difference between a man who disappoints you because he does not care and one who disappoints you because he is only just learning, at 30, how to see his own family clearly for the first time. I chose to be patient with the second kind, though I no longer confused that patience with gratitude, and I no longer mistook it for a debt I owed anyone but myself to keep paying. That first midwinter after the council, Almark held its old festival properly for the first time in years. Every hearth in the keep lit at once by the household's own hands rather than left to whichever servant remembered last. And I stood in the great hall watching Mathis argue with a kitchen boy over whose turn it was to feed the largest fire, and felt something in my chesties that I don't think had ever fully unclenched, in either of my lives, until that exact moment. "You look happy," Conrad said, coming to stand beside me, 2 cups of warmed wine in his hands. "I am," I said, and found, saying it aloud, that I meant it entirely, without the small private caveat I'd carried through every contented moment of my first life, the constant, exhausting arithmetic of wondering what the happiness would eventually cost me. I don't think I understood, until this house was finally mine to shape properly, how much of my first life I spent waiting for warmth to be rationed out to me, rather than simply making certain there was enough for everyone, myself included. "My mother would say that's an extravagant way to run a household," Conrad said, though there was no real argument in it. Only a rueful fondness for how thoroughly I'd already proven her wrong. "Your mother," I said, "ran a household on the theory that love was a resource too scarce to spend freely. I've found since taking over her hearths that the opposite is true. It only runs short when you let the wrong people convince you to hoard it." We fostered 2 more children in the years after Mathis, a girl named for no one in particular who arrived half-starved from a border famine and left. A decade later, commanding her own household with a steadiness I take a quiet private pride in having helped build, and a boy Hansa herself found abandoned near the market road, who grew into the finest horse breeder the March had seen in 2 generations. None of them were mine by blood. All of them, by the time I was done, were mine by every measure that ever actually mattered. Joran wrote to me himself, some 8 years after the council, a single careful letter with no return address, thanking me for the fostering I'd arranged and telling me, briefly, that he'd taken up a trade in glasswork under the family who'd raised him and found, to his own evident surprise, that he did not miss the march or its politics at all. I wrote back only once, wishing him well, and did not press for more than he was willing to give. Some doors are kinder left ajar than forced fully open. I think some winters, about the woman who died in an unheated room, still telling herself that a mother's worth was measured in how much cruelty she could absorb without complaint. I am sorry for her, the way you're sorry for a stranger's daughter. I no longer mistake her patience for a virtue worth returning to. I spent my whole first life believing that love had to be earned through endless, silent giving, that a woman who complained about a cold room had only herself to blame for expecting too much warmth in the first place. I know better now. Love that must be purchased with your own slow disappearance was never love at all. Only a very old, very comfortable kind of theft, dressed up in a family's colours so no one, least of all the woman being robbed, would think to call it by its true name. Every hearth in Almark burns through the night now, in every corridor, in every season, whether or not anyone important is watching to see that it does. I built that rule out of my own coldest memory, and I have never once regretted the wood it costs to keep. That, in the end, is the only inheritance I ever meant to leave behind.